The leaf once stained with secrets is now nowhere to be found. Dear listeners, welcome to the channel The Wimsey Casebook. This is Morgan Finch speaking. Drop a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from. And now, the story unfolds, The Vanishing of the Ink-Stained Leaf, by Dorothy L. Sayers. It is a truth insufficiently acknowledged in the county of Shropshire that an inherited manuscript is almost always more trouble than it is worth, unless one counts as worth the discovery of disputed wills, sulphurous family feuds, or sudden deaths amidst Georgian inkstands and good Scotch. That Dr. Horace Fentiman of Larkinghall Antiquarian Trust had not properly considered this principle before opening the walnut box bequeathed by his godfather was, in retrospect, a miscalculation of tragic proportions. The leaf in question, a single page no more than 6 inches across, was discovered sandwiched between brittle pages of a 16th century edition of Tragediae Senecae, annotated in a tight Latin hand and vaguely attributed to a sometime dean of Ely. The ink had bled at the corners, suggesting water damage, though Dr. Fentiman swore it had been untouched since its sealing by the late Archdeacon Hargrave. But it was the content, rather than the parchment itself, that made Fentiman's face go ashy beneath the chandelier's dusty glow. A few slanted lines in Middle English verse, and then a scrawl in blacker ink that might once have formed the word vengeance. When Fentiman made the fateful decision to show the leaf to the committee that governed the trust, comprised of a poetaster, a dowager, a retired librarian, and, regrettably, Colonel Brierly, who believed Latin a form of indigestion, it disappeared. Not mislaid, not misfiled, gone. 3 nights later, Dr. Fentiman was found collapsed across his escritoire, his head unnaturally twisted as though he'd turned, sharply and finally, to hear a voice behind him. The chair had toppled with him. The lamp on the desk was cold, and in the hearth, scattered like ritual embers, were 5 scraps of burnt parchment, none of them the right size. Enter Lord Peter Wimsey, who, upon invitation by the Dowager Lady Moffat, "Because you're the only man I know who once caught a murderer by noticing an Oxford comma," arrived on the afternoon train from Paddington, dressed in a grey check travelling suit, carrying a tan valise and a volume of Mallarmé. "I observe," said Lord Peter, as he stepped into the dim oak-panelled study where Fentiman had breathed his last, "that our poor doctor had quite the unfortunate habit of rearranging books while dying. Either that, or someone thought that Theophyses belonged on the shelf with erotic Provençal verse." He knelt, not at the body, now removed, but before the fireplace. "Curious," he murmured, poking the edge of a burnt scrap with his gold-handled pencil. "You'd think a man inclined to burn something would do so properly. This smacks of indecision." Or interruption. Detective Inspector Todd of the local constabulary, a stolid fellow with whiskers like 2 sullen foxes, cleared his throat. "It looks accidental. Heart attack most likely. No signs of struggle. And the lady who found him swears the door was bolted from the inside." "Ah," said Lord Peter, turning the poker between his fingers like a conductor idly composing a sinister adagio. "Then we have all the makings of a classic closed-room death, sans the obliging corpse lying with a dagger in its back, and a note saying, 'It was the butler.'" Todd grunted. "You don't think it's murder, Lord Wimsey?" "Oh, no, not at all." Lord Peter smiled faintly. "Only that the ink on the burnt leaf, what remains of it, is not the same as the ink in any of Fentiman's pens, nor does it match the bottle on his desk. Nor, I dare say, the ink used to sign the Larking Trust documents so conveniently modified last week." He paused, eyes drifting upward to the heavy beams overhead. "I should very much like to know," he said softly, "why a man so meticulous as Fentiman left his safe unlocked on the day he died, and why, having done so, he placed the key inside his boot. A man doesn't hide what isn't missing. The wind, meanwhile, tickled through the cracked window panes, and in the garden below the gardener's boy was seen pulling up a rose bush by mistake, revealing something pale, waxy, and folded at the roots. But that, of course, would come to notice only later, for now Lord Peter's gaze fell once more to the fireplace. He leaned forward, extracted a charred fragment with tweezers from his waistcoat, and held it to the lamplight. Then, with an exhale, that might have been amusement or melancholy, he murmured, "Well now, someone's used gall ink. Very old-fashioned, very permanent and very peculiar if you wanted something to disappear." The parlour at Larking Hall smelled faintly of pressed lavender, boiled ham, and a great deal of inherited anxiety. The Dowager Lady Moffat, resplendent in a chair designed for a smaller woman, presided like a queen consort abandoned by time, but not by entitlement. Her hat, an arrangement of feathers and faded violets, trembled with barely contained vexation as she motioned Lord Peter to the high-backed chair beside the unlit hearth. "I tell you, Lord Peter, I have never trusted that man Hargrave. Dead or not, he always looked like someone who misplaces things on purpose. The very idea of entrusting an unreviewed manuscript to the trust, it's as bad as handing the Book of Kells to a Boy Scout troop." Lord Peter, legs elegantly crossed, took a sip of indifferent tea and blinked with tolerant civility. The Archdeacon was, by all accounts, rather given to historical drama. There's a story about him challenging the Bishop of Gloucester to a debate about martyrdom while dressed as Thomas More. Exactly the sort of thing. And that godson of his, Fentiman, well, I never did like the way he arranged his spectacles on his waistcoat, as if to suggest they had opinions of their own. Wimsey nodded gravely. "And yet he seems to have been the only one who took the manuscript seriously. That suggests sincerity or guilt. Either can be fatal in such quantities," the Dowager sniffed. He was frightened. "Last Tuesday, I came in unexpectedly and found him staring at the library clock as if it had just condemned him to hang." "Did he say anything?" "He murmured something about shadows growing the wrong way and asked if I'd seen a particular leaf. I assumed he meant a page from that wretched thing, though, for all I know, he meant a blasted chestnut." Lord Peter's eyes twinkled. "We'll keep both options open for now." He rose. "Might I have a word with the staff? The people who see everything, say nothing, and move like ghosts in sensible shoes?" Within the hour, the Larking Hall servants had been summoned to the back drawing-room, where a long oak table stood between them and the man with the monocle. It was an odd procession. Mrs. Frigg, the cook-housekeeper with forearms like cannonballs, and a tight-lipped manner suggesting dark familiarity with arsenic. Parsons, the butler, whose grey eyebrows arched like church spires at the mention of scandal. Young Ivy, the scullery maid, who clutched her apron as if it might fly away from shame. And finally, Murch, the part-time gardener and general factotum, who looked perpetually startled, as though caught hiding a pheasant. Lord Peter leaned on the table, all easy charm and mental mousetraps. "Tell me, Mrs. Frigg, was Dr. Fentiman in the habit of reading late?" The cook sniffed. "He read all hours, my lord. Said it was the only way to silence the squalid brass section of the modern age. A phrase worthy of preservation. Did you ever notice him hiding anything?" "No, my lord, but I do recall him once burning toast and saying it reminded him of betrayal." Wimsey nodded, as if that confirmed a theory only he could follow. He turned to Parsons. "And you, Parsons, you've been with the trust some years." 21 come June, my lord. An excellent innings. Have you ever had occasion to open the safe?" "Not once, my lord. Dr. Fentiman kept the combination quite private. Though I once heard him muttering numbers in his sleep, 49 St. Luke, St. John, quite ecclesiastical, if I may say so." "Indeed. And when was the last time you saw the good doctor alive? Evening before he was found. He asked for a pot of assam and said he was ready now. Ready for what? Parsons hesitated. He didn't say, my lord, but he kissed a picture of his mother on the mantelpiece before retiring. Very out of character. Wimsey jotted a note. Next came Ivy, whose knuckles were white against her apron. Don't be afraid, Wimsey said gently. We're merely reconstructing a moment, not accusing anyone of murder or misfiled linen. The girl's lip trembled. I didn't see much, sir. But on Tuesday night I was sent up with a tray of cold chicken and found the study door ajar. I thought I heard someone whispering. Whispering? In the study? Yes, sir. It sounded like the doctor, but also like someone replying. Could you make out words? She nodded slowly. He said, It's not yours to take, it was never yours. And then there was a sound like books falling. And the other voice? I couldn't tell, sir, but it was sharper. Woman-like, angry. Lord Peter gave her a warm smile. You've been very brave, Ivy. One last question, did you touch anything? I knocked the corner of a rug, I think. It was bunched, and I saw a feather. On the floor. Wimsey looked up. A feather? Yes. Sir, pale, downy. Might have come off the old chair's cushion, but I picked it up. I still have it, didn't want to be blamed. She pulled it from her pocket, a tiny ash-grey wisp, no longer than a finger's joint. Thank you, Wimsey said, inspecting it. I do so love a clue that doesn't announce itself with symbols. Last came Murch, who had been fidgeting with his cap as if unsure whether it belonged on his head or in a fire. I was digging round the west hedge, he mumbled, when I found summat odd. Yes? Wrapped in a bit of cloth, buried, shallow, like someone didn't want to go deep. And what was it? Murch produced a parcel, now dried and laid atop the table. Inside was a small brown notebook, its cover faded and stained. Wimsey flipped through it with long, careful fingers. The entries were scattered, quotes, translations, fragments of dreams. Then, halfway through, ink leaf, dangerous, names I don't understand. Is it a forgery? Or is it worse, true? Hargrave lied. Why? Why leave it to me? Something follows, smell of smoke. Twice I dreamt the same leaf speaking Latin. Nonsense. Wimsey closed the notebook. Well, he murmured, that's certainly not the weather report. He turned to the room, his expression bright and unreadable. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, that will be all for now. Though if anyone should find a misplaced metaphor or an unclaimed motive, do bring it to me post-haste. As the staff shuffled out, Wimsey stood alone in the dim room, staring at the grey feather in his palm. Then he whispered, a whispering voice, a single feather, a leaf that disappears, and a dying man who dreams in dead languages. It's beginning to feel almost too literary. His gaze drifted to the study window, where twilight had begun its descent, and in the distance a rook cawed just once before silence fell again over Larking Hall. When Miss Philippa Hargrave entered the morning room the following day, she brought with her an atmosphere of faint disapproval wrapped in impeccable wool. Her appearance suggested a woman determined never to be mistaken for her own tragedy. She wore no mourning, but her black gloves were of such severity they might have been tailored in a monastery. Her mouth was narrow, her eyes steely, and the way she carried her umbrella suggested it had been sharpened to a conversational point. Lord Peter, seated with a modest plate of Kedgeree and a not at all modest volume of Villon, rose with an apologetic smile. Miss Hargrave, I presume. You resemble your late father in all but beard and pomposity. She blinked not unkindly. And you, Lord Wimsey, are as flippant as they warned me. Though I confess I expected someone taller. Alas, my height stops just shy of intimidating. May I offer you tea or perhaps a rake to beat me with? Either seems in order." She allowed herself a faint smile and seated herself opposite. "I'm not here for pleasantries. I've been summoned by Lady Moffat, though why she believes I might help is unclear. My father and I were not aligned. Philosophically, morally." She removed her gloves, one finger at a time. "He was vain, theatrical, and possessed of a dangerous gift for embellishment. He collected secrets like spoons, and then, having amassed them, promptly made them somebody else's problem." "A generous bequest." "Hardly." She glanced at the teacup placed before her. "And I gather from the dowager that the manuscript or leaf or what have you is missing." "Quite vanished," said Wimsey, in a manner suggesting either clever concealment or very stupid burning. "And Dr. Fentiman has died in the process. Whether of fright, misadventure, or something more deliberate remains uncertain." Philippa Hargrave stirred her tea with deliberate care. "And you suspect me?" "Oh, not yet. But the local inspector is a great believer in family motives, especially when there's a legacy involved." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "Legacy? My father left me a pair of horn-rimmed glasses and a mahogany writing desk that smells of wet dog. The trust passed to his precious godson, and he, Fentiman, cut me from every serious scholarly consideration the moment he took over." Wimsey raised a brow. "Professional jealousy? No, personal contempt. He once accused me of forging a medieval acrostic simply because I corrected his misreading of a Chaucerian E." She set the spoon down. "That sort of man, Lord Wimsey, couldn't abide a woman with Latin." "Many can't abide Latin, full stop," he said. "But I do appreciate your candor." She stood. "I didn't want the manuscript, and I didn't want Horace Fentiman dead. But if you're asking whether I wished him silenced, then yes, I did. In a purely academic sense, of course." "Of course," Wimsey murmured. "I shall log that under honest vitriol. Do let me know if you remember anything. Any name, word, or scribble your father might have mentioned in connection with the leaf." "He used to mutter in his sleep," she said after a pause, "but only one phrase ever stood out, biber cruorum, to drink the blood." Wimsey blinked. "Charming." "Yes." He said it as though it were a toast. After she departed, Wimsey stood before the tall windows, watching the cold morning light drift through the trees. Philippa Hargrave was clearly intelligent, self-possessed, loathed the victim and had access to the property. Motive, means, opportunity, the golden trifecta of criminal investigation, and yet it felt too clean, too bookish. He turned from the window as Inspector Todd entered, holding a sheaf of statements like they might bite him. "Your Miss Hargrave has teeth, I'll give her that," Todd muttered. "Oh, quite. She's sharpened them on her father's reputation." Todd dropped into a chair. "But she's our best suspect, Lord Wimsey. Found arguing with Fentiman only last week, heard by 2 witnesses. He accused her of trying to undo sacred work." "Sounds dramatic. What's the sacred work in question?" "Preservation of the trust's integrity, apparently." Wimsey pursed his lips. "And what exactly is it that makes this vanished leaf worth killing over?" Todd flipped through his notes. "No consensus. Some say it's a poem, others a prophecy. One even claims it's a confession of heresy written by an Elizabethan bishop. Enough speculation for a decade of dinner parties." Wimsey reached into his coat and withdrew the grey feather from the night before. "Do you recognize this, Inspector?" Todd frowned. "Bird feather?" "I'd gathered as much. But Ivy, one of the maids, found it near the body. No pet birds. Here, and none of the upholstery accounts for it." Todd narrowed his eyes. "You think it was brought in?" "Possibly, or left behind by someone not entirely careful. Either way, it doesn't feel like Miss Hargrave's style." "She strikes me as precise, surgical almost, not one for loose feathers. They were interrupted by Parsons the butler, who coughed with the solemnity of a man announcing Armageddon. "Lady Moffat requests your presence in the upper corridor." "My lord, there's been a development." Wimsey followed him up the curling stairs and into the west wing, a part of the house long underutilized, if the dust was to be believed. Lady Moffat stood before a door that had once been painted lilac, now faded to bruise. "This room was my brother-in-law's study," she explained. "We haven't used it since 1923, but Ivy came running this morning. The door was ajar, though we always keep it locked." Inside was a room choked with dust, disuse, and the subtle dread of forgotten places. A long decayed map of the Levant clung to the far wall. Books, yellowed and curled, stood sentinel, and on the writing desk beside a cracked inkwell lay an envelope. A very modern envelope, addressed in clean black ink, "To whom the leaf may concern." Wimsey opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet, typed. The ink does not vanish, it bleeds. He took what was not his to take. He made a copy. He lied about the fire. "The true leaf speaks names no man should utter. Return it to silence." There was no signature, no date. Todd looked ill. "Someone's playing a game, Wimsey." "Yes," Wimsey murmured, "but not the sort one wins with points. This is theatre, and that suggests motive beyond theft, belief, obsession, perhaps even guilt." Lady Moffat dabbed her nose. "Do you think it's Philippa?" "Not yet. She strikes me as too clever for anonymous melodrama." He returned the letter to its envelope, glanced again at the inkwell. "Inspector," he said, "have your men check every antique shop within 20 miles for anyone selling 16th century pages, or offering to authenticate forged ones. And Miss Hargrave." Wimsey smiled thinly. "Let's not arrest the red herring before it's had its swim. There's something messier at work here. Fentiman didn't die because of a feud. He died in the middle of a performance, and I think someone was watching." The window rattled faintly as a breeze disturbed the curtain. Far below, in the Larking Hall garden, the gardener's boy had stopped digging and was pointing mutely at a patch of turned earth, and in that earth, barely visible beneath the frost, something metallic caught the light, round, thin, the size of a pocket watch, but older, perhaps older than it should have been. It was a curious fact, curious in the way that only the truly banal can become unsettling, that the curtains in Dr. Fentiman's study did not quite meet in the middle. Lord Peter Wimsey had noticed it on his second visit to the room, while pretending to admire a faintly atrocious watercolour of St. Swithin's on the Wold. The left panel of the brocade, a dour, rust-red affair embroidered with thistles, drooped, slightly as though attempting escape. The right held firm in the bracket, yet even when drawn a sliver of glass glimmered between them. "It's not the sort of thing a man like Fentiman would tolerate," Wimsey remarked aloud, though no one was present to hear it, but the afternoon sun and a very sleepy cat curled in the window seat. He leaned in and tugged the left curtain. The hook at the top had torn through the cloth, an old break, but recent enough to have left no dust in the gap. "Well, well," he murmured, extracting a small notebook from his pocket. He jotted 2 words, "curtain tension." From behind him came the telltale shuffle of Inspector Todd, carrying with him a rolled handkerchief and the scent of resolve, muddled by confusion. "We've sent the object from the garden. Turns out it's, say, wax seal, damaged, but probably ecclesiastical, to the museum fellows in Shrewsbury," said Todd. "It bears a faint Latin inscription, something about custodes veritatis, guardians of the truth. Poetic," said Wimsey, "though I might suggest an entirely different order of guardians if one's truth requires burying in rosebeds." Todd snorted. "You're amused, my lord." "I find I often am, Inspector. The alternative is to weep, and I haven't got the eyelashes for it. Todd dropped into the leather chair with a grunt. Your Miss Hargrave hasn't left the inn, but I did take the liberty of asking the maid to turn out her handbag. It contained the usual: keys, lipstick, a rather unfortunate poem, and a folded letter from her father dated 3 months before his death. Content? Mostly rambling, but one phrase stood out. The leaf must be made to speak, not remain silent. Too long has its ink lain dormant. It burns even in darkness. Wimsey's smile flickered. Dormant ink. That's rather like calling a matchbook restful. He wandered toward the bookshelf again, his fingers tracing the spines, not with interest, but calculation. One volume, bound in faux vellum, resisted the pressure of his touch. He pulled it out, a French treatise on hermeneutics utterly dry, and examined the gap it left. Nothing behind it, but the shelf had been shifted slightly out of alignment. He stooped. Do we know whether Dr. Fentiman had a habit of working on the floor? Todd blinked. The floor? Yes. There's candle wax on the carpet, recent, and slightly scented. He dipped a gloved finger and sniffed it delicately. Lavender and aniseed, he said. Curious combination. The kind of thing one might use in ceremonial contexts, or bath salts. But Fentiman wasn't a bathing man, was he? Not famously. And the wax has dripped in a circle, a deliberate one. He stood and faced the room again, his gaze scanning the space as if the furniture had something to confess. Inspector, would you humor me in a brief reenactment? Todd groaned. If I must. Take the chair, yes, there, and pretend, if you will, that you've just read something very unsettling. You fear it may cost you your standing, possibly your life. What do you do? Todd played along with the sluggish reluctance of a man who suspected he was being led into farce. He sat mind-reading, scowled. I burn it, he said. Excellent. You rise, walk to the fireplace, but note the chair's angle. It's turned slightly, as though... Wimsey grabbed the arms and rotated the chair 6 degrees. Yes, like that. Facing the curtain. Why? What does one see at this angle? Todd followed his gaze. The gap in the curtain admitted a thin beam of light, right across the escritoire. Not unusual, except... There's a flash here, Wimsey whispered, touching the desk's corner. See that? Someone placed a mirror here. A signal, perhaps, or an observation point. Are you suggesting someone was watching him through that curtain? I'm suggesting someone knew exactly when to act, knew when the leaf would be exposed. Whether they killed for it or only watched, I don't yet know. Yet. But the tension of the curtain suggests it was recently tampered with. And the safe, he turned to the wall. Do we know whether the safe was inventoried after Fentiman's death? Todd shook his head. Not yet. Then it's high time it was. Within 10 minutes, Parsons had produced the safe's key, taken discreetly from the doctor's boot post-mortem, and Lord Peter knelt before the metal door with an expression of theatrical reverence. Open, O crypt of forgotten scholarship, he intoned, twisting the lock. The door creaked open. Inside, a sheaf of bound pamphlets, a velvet-lined box of silver coins, and, most interestingly, a tiny bottle of ink. The label had been scraped off. Not the desk ink, Wimsey said. Not the kind used for drafts. This is dense, gall-based, I'd wager. The same as the burnt leaf. He held it to the light. A faint sediment clung to the base. And something else, see that? He said. A film, slightly greenish. Someone tampered with this ink, either infused it with a reagent or altered its chemical consistency for visibility under particular conditions. Like invisible ink? Todd asked. Worse, Wimsey murmured. Selective ink, designed to appear under pressure or heat. Or even... He trailed off. Or even blood, he said quietly. There was silence. "I'm beginning to think," he said slowly, "that the ink-stained leaf was more than a document. It was a trap, a confession or a summoning, or both. Linguistic puzzle tied to something older, possibly even something forged in belief." Todd rubbed his face. "This is madness." "Not madness," said Wimsey. "Devotion. The truly dangerous kind. The kind that begins in libraries and ends with someone burning their own hands to keep a secret." He replaced the ink bottle, locked the safe, and pocketed his notes. "One last thing," he added, almost as an afterthought. "There's a faint scent in this room, not the candle wax, something sharper." Todd sniffed. "Clove and vinegar. It's a preservation mixture used in manuscript restoration. I'd wager someone used it here recently, perhaps while tampering with the leaf." Todd frowned. "But we haven't seen any bottles of that." "No," said Wimsey, eyes narrowing. "We haven't. Which means someone removed them, or someone is using them still elsewhere." He walked to the door, paused, and looked back once more at the curtain, the fireplace, and the desk that still seemed to whisper. Then, to no one in particular, he murmured, "I wonder, when a leaf vanishes, does it fall from a tree? Or was it never part of the tree to begin with?" He shut the door softly behind him. Outside, the cat in the window stretched, yawned, and promptly went back to sleep. The charm of the village railway station at Nether Larking was its complete unsuitability for any affair more serious than a lost umbrella. That it now found itself tangentially involved in a probable murder was, as the station master put it to his wife, a grim business for a place built mainly to house pigeons and forgetful retirees. Lord Peter Wimsey stood on the platform beneath a clock, whose hands quivered in hesitation rather than resolve. A copy of the Shrewsbury Courier flapped against the nearby bench, unread and unimportant. Wimsey's gaze, however, was fixed on the chalked timetable mounted beneath the glass of the arrivals board. "Tuesday," he murmured, tracing the arrivals from Shrewsbury. 10:16 a.m., 12:07 p.m., 2:40 p.m., 5:12 p.m. Inspector Todd, beside him, looked unconvinced. "This helps us how exactly?" Wimsey gave him a patient smile. "Consider the statements we've received, Inspector. Lady Moffat claims she encountered Dr. Fentiman in the library at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. Ivy swears she brought his supper at 6:30, yet the body was found cold by 10 and the lamp was never lit. Sounds right." "Except," said Wimsey, turning away from the board, "the gardener, Murch, insists he saw Dr. Fentiman walking toward the summer house at 4. He's very clear about it. And here's the rub. Lady Moffat also insists that between 3 and 4 she was in the garden herself, pruning the heliotropes. She says she saw no one." Todd scratched his chin. "So someone's mistaken. Or lying." They returned to Larking Hall as the sky softened into that peculiar English dusk which feels like memory itself, a colour neither present nor absent, like the moment before a secret is spoken aloud. Wimsey, back in the study, stood once more before the bookshelf. "Let's suppose," he said aloud, though Todd had wandered off in pursuit of tea, "that Fentiman was already dead by 4, that Murch saw someone else. Someone dressed like the doctor. Could it be? Or—" He opened the desk drawer again. No new documents, no sudden revelations. Just the usual clutter of a scholar's detritus, ink-stained rags, a cracked magnifying glass, a tin of lozenges that had expired during the Edwardian period. But in the wastebasket, something caught his eye. A train ticket stub, Shrewsbury, to Nether Larking, date Tuesday, time 2:40 p.m. "Well," Wimsey said softly, "that's rather inconvenient." He pocketed the stub and sought out Ivy, who was polishing silver in the back parlour with the intensity of one avenging a vendetta. "Ivy," he said gently, "you're certain you saw Dr. Fentiman at 6:30? She nodded quickly. "Yes. Sir, I took up the tray myself. He thanked me and said he was expecting something. Something or someone," she hesitated. "I thought he said the light, but I can't be sure. He was speaking oddly." Wimsey tapped the mantelpiece. "And did you actually see his face?" Well, no. He was seated, turned away. "Reading." Wimsey smiled. "Thank you, Ivy. You've been most helpful." Back in the study, he found Todd waiting with 2 teacups and an expression of polite dread. "You've thought of something," said Todd flatly. "I've thought of several somethings," replied Wimsey. "Let's walk through it." He outlined the problem on the desk blotter with a borrowed pencil. Lady Moffat sees Fentiman at 3. Murch sees him at 4. Ivy speaks to him at 6:30. But the train ticket I've just found, purchased, for 2:40 p.m. from Shrewsbury, implies someone else arrived that day, possibly unannounced. Todd frowned. "You think someone impersonated the doctor?" "I think someone planned an arrival, possibly to retrieve or replace the ink-stained leaf, possibly to confront Fentiman. We don't know, but it would explain the gap." "But the body?" Wimsey pointed to the blotter. "That's the fascinating thing. No rigor mortis noted in the reports. No mention of when precisely he died, just that he was found late Tuesday evening." "And you're suggesting he died earlier than believed?" "Or later," said Wimsey. "Suppose the real Dr. Fentiman did leave the property at some point. Suppose the man Ivy spoke to was not him, but a stand-in, either willingly involved or deceived." Todd stared. "That's a bit of a stretch, my lord." Wimsey shrugged. "Mystery rarely fits within the polite perimeters of police reports. We must allow for creative angles." He leaned forward. "And what if the real Fentiman returned after dark? Suppose he found the leaf missing or altered. Suppose he lit no lamp so as not to disturb or not to be seen. Then what?" asked Todd. "Then someone was already waiting," said Wimsey. He rose. "I need the train records for Tuesday, all arrivals and departures, and I want to know if anyone reported a lost parcel or sent a telegram from the station." "And what about Miss Hargrave?" "She's clever," said Wimsey, "but too precise. Her style is ink, not blood. No, I think there's someone else. Someone who understands ink as invocation, and someone who understands performance." Todd blinked. "Performance." Wimsey walked to the fireplace. "Do you recall the envelope left in the upstairs study? To whom the leaf may concern. Rather theatrical, no? Someone's playing to an audience. And who's the audience?" "Us," said Wimsey. Just then a knock came at the door. Parsons entered holding a folded newspaper. "Arrived by post, my lord, marked for your attention." Wimsey opened it. Inside, on page 3, a small article had been circled in red pencil. "Scholar found dead in Shrewsbury flat. Mr. Linwood." Cope, 47, was discovered in his home, surrounded by manuscript fragments and lit candles. Police report unusual Latin phrases scrawled on the wall in ink resembling blood. Authorities uncertain if death was accident, suicide, or something more sinister. Wimsey exhaled. "Linwood Cope," he said. "Name sound familiar?" Todd blinked. "Didn't Fentiman mention him in that notebook?" "He did, once, just once. Cope says the ink leaf is older than it seems. But where does it lead?" He turned to the window. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I believe we are no longer dealing with a mere theft or a family feud. We are dealing with something far more elaborate. A manuscript that kills, perhaps not by curse, but by what it reveals to the wrong man." Todd sat back, stunned. And far below, in the mail basket by the hall door, another envelope lay unnoticed. No stamp, no return address. Inside it, a single word typed on crisp paper. It was nearly dusk when Lord Peter Wimsey returned once more to the library at Larkinghall. But this time he carried with him not only a small leather valise, and an armful of reference books, but also the creeping certainty that Dr. Horace Fentiman had not been the man his colleagues, or even his closest associates, had believed him to be. The study was empty, save for the mellow ticking of a long-disused barometer and the faint scent of worn leather that clung to the bindings like memory itself. Parsons had left a decanter of port by the hearth and had departed with the sort of professional discretion that one develops only after years of overhearing secrets and never once being asked to repeat them. Lord Peter set the valise down on the floor, opened a slender volume of 17th-century marginalia, and thumbed through the pages until he found the name he had marked earlier in pencil, Linwood Cope. The reference was brief, a mere citation in the footnote of an obscure pamphlet discussing medieval palimpsests and the dangerous seduction of overwritten texts. Cope had argued, apparently, that certain scribes intentionally reused parchment that bore condemnations of heretics, believing it spiritually potent. Wimsey closed the book with a thoughtful tap of his fingers. "It seems," he murmured, "that both Cope and Fentiman believed texts could retain something of the ideas they once bore, rather like houses, really, echoes in the walls." He turned to the envelope found that morning in the mail basket. The single word, translate, was typed in a machine font just faintly misaligned, as though the letter had been struck on a second-hand typewriter long out of date. The word haunted him. What precisely was he being asked to translate? A manuscript. Motive a man? It was just then that Philippa Hargrave re-entered the narrative, not so much with a flourish as a veiled resignation. She appeared at the door of the study, pale and unslept, clutching a folder wrapped in brown paper and tied with white string. "I found this," she said without preamble, "among Father's effects. I had to borrow a key. I thought it was just more of his nonsense, but then I saw your name on one of the margins. I decided you should have it." Wimsey gestured to the fireside chair. "My dear Miss Hargrave, nothing excites a detective more than documents delivered after hours by intelligent women. You may have saved me from the purgatory of amateur Latin poetry." She did not smile. She sat heavily, as though the act itself were an admission of defeat. Wimsey opened the folder carefully. Inside was a typescript essay, annotated in Dr. Fentiman's unmistakable crabbed hand. The title was curious, "The Ink-Stained Leaf." Hypothesis on textual possession. He skimmed the pages quickly. Fentiman outlined a theory that certain texts, especially those copied in solitude, under duress, or in deliberate secrecy, could act as vessels for the subconscious. He cited examples from obscure abbeys, monasteries, and even one from a Russian prison camp, where inmates began hallucinating after reading a single page of a smuggled prayer book. In the margins, phrases stood out: Cope wrong about intention, but right about effect. Transmission not just linguistic, psychic resonance? The leaf is not a leaf, it's a cipher, no, something older. Wimsey looked up. "Why did your father keep this hidden?" Philippa's lips were bloodless. "Because he believed it. He believed the leaf contained something not merely ancient but dangerous. He spoke of unlocking speech that should never be heard. At first I thought it was religious mania. But toward the end, he began saying strange things, writing in mirror script, carrying gloves into the library. And once, just once, I caught him speaking in a voice I didn't recognize." "A voice?" She nodded. "Low, rhythmic, as though reciting. And when I asked him about it, he said he was merely translating the untranslatable." Lord Peter's mind ticked forward. "And did he ever mention Linwood Cope directly?" Her face went still. "Yes, once. They were part of a small circle. Academic eccentrics. They exchanged marginalia on fragments too controversial to publish. Cope was obsessed with ink compositions, claimed he could date a manuscript by scent. Wimsey sat back. Fentiman, then, was not merely a scholar. He was in his own way an alchemist, a man who believed he could uncover something timeless in a single page. Philippa said nothing. "And you?" he asked. "How much of it did you believe?" "I believed in evidence," she replied, looking away. "Until now." There was a silence, broken only by the soft clink of the decanter's stopper, as Wimsey poured her a measure of port. "You said earlier," he said at length, "that your father was theatrical. What did you mean by that?" "He had rituals. He wrote by candlelight even during the day. He salted the thresholds to his office. And he made a habit of carrying a black book with him, always the same one. He called it his Codex Domestica. He said it contained translations that had not yet happened." "Not yet happened?" She nodded slowly. His way of saying they were waiting, that the words hadn't finished forming. Wimsey stood and crossed to the fire. The shadows behind him lengthened, creating a silhouette that flickered against the bookshelves like a warning. "Miss Hargrave," he said carefully, "there is something else, isn't there?" "Something you haven't told me." She looked up sharply. "On the night Dr. Fentiman died, where were you, truly?" There was a long pause. "I arrived in the village that morning," she said finally. "But I didn't come to the hall. I went to the old rectory. It's abandoned. I knew the key was still behind the sundial. I wanted to read, to think. I didn't want him to know I was nearby. Did you see him at all?" "No. But I saw the window, lit, and I saw someone move past it. Not him, taller, moving differently, like they knew the room." "Did you come forward?" "I was afraid. And now? Now I think whoever that was wasn't just watching him. They were waiting for him to make a mistake." Wimsey nodded slowly. "And I believe he did," he said. He opened the folder again and examined the last page of the essay. There, scrawled in haste, were 3 words, barely legible but etched deep into the paper. "Leaf bled true." And in the margin, "Philippa must never..." The rest was torn. Wimsey stared at the gap. Then he said almost absently, "Tell me, did your father ever own a peacock?" "A peacock?" "Yes. One dropped feather. Pale grey. Very fine." She shook her head. "No peacocks. But there was a visitor, a man once or twice, kept doves, I think, said they were sacred. And his name, I never heard it." Lord Peter stood again. "We're looking, Miss Hargrave, not for a killer in the conventional sense, but for someone who believes that murder can be a form of punctuation." In the corner of the Larking Hall study, where the wallpaper curled, slightly from damp and the oak skirting board, bore the pale scars of old furniture removals, stood a mahogany pedestal cabinet. It was the sort of object one might overlook in favor of grander curiosities. A globe bar, a brass telescope, or the taxidermied buzzard that presided over the upper landing like a judgmental ancestor. Yet Lord Peter Wimsey, who never trusted, a piece of furniture that looked too unassuming, had begun to eye it with the speculative interest he usually reserved for unsigned codicils or poorly staged alibis. He crouched before it that evening, the fire throwing soft amber shadows across the parquet, and opened the front panel. The cabinet, though externally neat, was internally haphazard. A stack of misfiled receipts, a handful of used sealing wafers, 2 dried ink bottles, and, oddest of all, a cheap paperback titled Murderer's Medium, a study in occult symbolism. In crime, its cover emblazoned with a melodramatic pentagram and what purported to be bloodstains, printed rather than actual, Wimsey noted wryly. He held up the book between thumb and forefinger, as one might hold a rather soiled handkerchief. "Not quite the scholarship one would expect from Dr. Fentiman," he murmured. It was badly dog-eared, with margin notes in 3 distinct hands, one sharp and slanted, one looping and ornate, and one, a cramped, minute script that looked like it had been written by someone trained in the clerical traditions of the 14th century. On page 147, beside a passage describing ritual concealment of objects to invoke psycho-spiritual resonance, someone had underlined the phrase, "Items placed beneath footings of wood or stone may retain psychic imprint of last act performed in their presence." Beneath it in Fentiman's script, "Study desk, oak panel by hearth." Wimsey stared for a long moment, then stood. He tapped along the floorboards until he found a slight irregularity, the hollow echo of a dislodged plank. Within moments, he had pried it free with the aid of a paper knife and his own patient instinct. Beneath the plank, wrapped in a piece of felted cloth, was a single brass key. No tag, no engraving. He held it to the light. "Hello," he said softly. "You don't belong here." He returned to the cabinet and searched again. The second drawer yielded a further surprise, a glass slide, of the sort used in microscopes. It bore a smear of dried ink and, written on a slip of paper inside the envelope, the phrase, "Only visible under pressure." He pocketed both the slide and the key, then turned his attention to the desk chair. The seat cushion sagged subtly on the right, and as he lifted the edge he found, wedged between the fabric and the wooden seat, a folded sheet of notepaper. It had been crumpled and smoothed out again, as though the author had changed their mind halfway through writing it. It read, "The words bleed backwards. I saw the pattern, but only when the light was dim. When spoken aloud, they did not echo. Cope insisted I stop, said I was crossing into meta-linguistic inversion. But the pattern is real. I dream it now. I think Philippa knows. She mustn't. No signature." But the handwriting was unmistakably Fentiman's. Wimsey exhaled through his nose. A knock at the door announced Parsons, bearing a tray with a pot of coffee, 2 cups, and a small envelope balanced beside the sugar bowl. "The Morning Post, my tea." "Lord," he said, "delayed at the station due to a confusion over the new mail coach route." "Ah, the romance of rural infrastructure," said Wimsey, taking the envelope. It was postmarked Shrewsbury and bore only his name in spidery ink. Inside was a photograph, grainy, overexposed, but clearly showing Dr. Fentiman standing outside a small building, perhaps a library, shaking hands with a man in a long coat. The reverse read, "St. Cyprian's Annex, March 1929. H. Fentiman and J. No further identification." Lord Peter poured coffee and turned the photo slowly in his fingers. It was then that Philippa appeared again, silent as breath, at the threshold. She was dressed in grey and had the expression of one who had just realized that a locked door may not protect against what is already inside. "I remembered something," she said without preamble, "about the leaf, about the night father changed." Wimsey set down his cup. "It was 2 years ago," she continued. "He came back from some private meeting, never said with whom. He was wet through, but his hands were burning, literally hot. He said he had touched original fire. I thought he meant metaphorically until he showed me a blister on his thumb." "Did he say what he had seen?" She shook her head. "Only that the leaf had been altered or replaced, that the words no longer matched his memory." "And did he show it to you?" "No, but he hid it." "Where?" "I don't know, but he kept muttering about reversals, about speaking backwards. He stopped writing in Latin and started in phonetic runes. I think he thought it was safer." Wimsey stood and offered her the photograph. "Do you recognize the man?" Philippa studied it, then paled. "Yes, that's Julian Westcott, a fellow classicist. Brilliant once, went odd, started dabbling in textual spiritism, he called it. Claimed to have decoded a lost curse from the Carthaginian tablets. Father cut ties." Wimsey nodded slowly. Then I suspect Westcott is our shadow, perhaps even our visitor, and possibly the last person to see your father alive. He glanced again at the cabinet. One more thing. Do you recall a brass key? She frowned. Yes. It was to the old vault at the church, part of a restoration. Project years ago. Father said it was useless until something turned up that shouldn't have. What sort of something? He never told me, only that it came wrapped in black oilcloth and had been hidden in the crypt walls. He said it confirmed something he hadn't wanted confirmed. Wimsey's voice, when it came, was very quiet. Miss Hargrave, I think your father wasn't mad. He met her eyes. I think he discovered something. Something buried, once perhaps out of fear, then dug up again by men who believed too much in the power of language and not enough in the weight of consequences. She looked down, and I think, he added, that we're not alone in wanting it silenced. There was a creak behind them. Nothing unusual, only the house settling or perhaps a draught, and yet the shadows in the far corner of the study had grown a little deeper. Outside, a single dove circled the grey chimney pots and landed with unusual precision on the peak of the conservatory roof. Its eyes were pale, almost blind. The study at Larking Hall was quiet again. Late evening light had thinned into that fragile post-twilight where everything becomes either gold or grey. Lord Peter Wimsey sat at the desk with the posture of a man who could, if he wished, uncoil like a whip, but instead chose to lounge as though solving mysteries were a leisurely pursuit, no more urgent than shelling peas. Before him lay three objects: the brass key from beneath the floorboard, the ink-smudged microscope, slide, and the note that read translate. Around them, the rest of the desk was in careful disarray. Fragments of correspondence, scraps from Dr. Fentiman's notebooks, and several curious smudges of black ink that shimmered faintly under the desk lamp. Wimsey held the slide delicately, between thumb and forefinger, and turned the light. A ripple passed through the smear. Not mere ink, he now understood, but some hybrid compound. Oil-based gall, perhaps, but infused with something faintly metallic. Under the heat of the lamp, faint shapes began to emerge, serpentine curves, looping sigils, and at last letters. Latin, of course, but irregular. He fetched a magnifying glass from his valise and peered closely. "Libera me, ex lingua mortuorum." He translated aloud, "Deliver me from the language of the dead." He blinked once, twice. Either our dear doctor was dabbling in apotropaic linguistics, he murmured, or someone with a vivid imagination decided to rebrand exorcism in epistolary form. He flipped open his notebook, where he had begun, cataloguing the elements of the case not in traditional narrative order, but spatially, like rooms in a house, each connected by a thread of motive, opportunity, or belief. One column read, Philippa Hargrave. Knew of the manuscript. Academic rivalry with Fentiman. Repressed knowledge of father's descent into obsession. Claims no access on night of death. Another. Julian Westcott, shadowy associate. Believed in psychic resonance of text. Possibly visited Larking Hall. Seen. In photo with Fentiman. Dovekeeper. Another written in darker ink. The ink-stained leaf, burned or not. Last seen by Fentiman. Possibly altered. Possibly hidden. Associated with key, slide, and phrase leaf bled true. Below all of it, he had written a single phrase boxed in pencil. What did Fentiman know, and when did he become dangerous to someone else? He pushed his chair back and crossed to the fireplace. The wax stains on the carpet still bore the faint geometry of ritual, whether real or imagined. He crouched, ran a hand along the hearthstone, and frowned. One corner was uneven, lifted, ever so slightly from the surrounding stonework. A few moments with his penknife revealed a hidden groove. With the careful pressure of his fingertips, he prized it open. Inside was a hollow recess, dry, cold, and empty, save for a scorched scrap of parchment folded 4 times and sealed with a thread of what appeared to be human hair. Wimsey unfolded it with great care. A single line of text ran across the center. Ut verba sesinerint ita mors audivit. As the words were sung, so death listened. Wimsey stood slowly. "Well," he said softly, "that's theatrical, even for a philologist." He placed the scrap in a glass slide holder and returned to the desk. There, he retrieved a box from beneath. His valise. Inside, a portable ultraviolet light. He clicked it on, passed it over the parchment. He turned to Westcott. "Would you care to translate?" Westcott's face remained unchanged, but a bead of sweat appeared at his collar. Lady Moffat leaned in, wide-eyed. Philippa rose slowly, as if drawn by gravity. Todd narrowed his eyes, and Wimsey, ever so gently, let the silence deepen. Julian Westcott did not reach for the leaf. He merely looked at it, at the encased whisper-thin sliver of vellum, faded and ink-stained, seemingly so fragile that the mere suggestion of breath might crumple it, and gave a slow, deliberate shake of the head. "Translate," he said, his voice dry as unturned soil. "No, not allowed." Lord Peter Wimsey raised a brow. "Curious. For a man who once held lectures entitled Unlocking the Polyphonic Mind, you seem uncharacteristically reluctant to engage with a bit of parchment." Westcott smiled faintly, but it was the smile of a man choosing silence over confession, deflection, over denial. Wimsey let the moment linger. Then he turned away from the desk and addressed the room. "Very well. Allow me to read. Not from the leaf itself, of course, but from Fentiman's own notes, which, one might say, anticipated this precise refusal." He opened a folder and withdrew a sheet filled with cramped handwriting. "He believes the ink speaks beyond the words," he read. "But he forgets that the true power lies not in symbols, but in interpretation. He will tamper, he will insert. He already has. The false leaf burns clean. The true one resists, as though it knows what it contains." Wimsey looked up. "You?" See, Dr. Fentiman had begun to suspect that the original leaf, his sacred relic, if you like, had been altered. Not physically at first. No one had stolen it. But its message had begun to change. Under heat, it revealed letters that had never been there. Names, dates, warnings. He glanced around the room. "Philippa, you once said your father believed." The leaf spoke differently after his final meeting with Westcott. She nodded slowly. "He said it had turned against him." "Precisely. But it hadn't changed on its own. It had been tampered with, coated, most likely, with a secondary chemical layer applied to the ink. Perhaps when Fentiman last loaned it for preservation review, perhaps earlier. But the effect was clear. Under flame or friction, the script evolved. It showed things it had not shown before. Lady Moffat, wide-eyed, clutched her handkerchief, like a flag of truce. "But why? What possible use could that serve?" "Power," Wimsey said simply. "Control, conviction." For Westcott, the leaf was no longer just a fragment of text. It was a testament, and like all testaments, it needed witnesses. He turned back to Westcott. "You believed you could awaken it, that the ink could be coaxed into revealing something final. But Fentiman, perhaps out of guilt or jealousy or simple academic purity, refused. He saw what you had done and planned to expose you." Westcott folded his arms. "You presume much." "I do," said Wimsey cheerfully, "but my presumptions are built on a sturdy scaffold of facts. For example, Ivy the maid hears 2 voices. On the night of Fentiman's death, one his, one another's, indistinct, angry. She finds the rug disturbed. We find wax patterns on the floor. shaped not unlike protective circles used in ritual studies. We find soot in the vestry chimney directly above the vault, used, I suspect, to activate the leaf's alterations from a distance. He stepped closer to the fireplace, and we find a note left unfinished reading, "Philippa must never," which is curious, because if he suspected you, Westcott, why write a warning about her? Philippa straightened. "You think he suspected me?" "I think," Wimsey said gently. "He feared for you, but not because you were involved, because he had involved you, unwittingly." He turned back to the desk, picked up the ink slide, and held it under the candlelight. The shimmering letters danced. "He used your work, didn't he? Some old experiment, a student project, or something you mentioned in passing. He incorporated it, mixed it with his own ideas. And then when the ink began to shift and shimmer, he didn't understand why, not fully, and he panicked." Philippa's voice was barely audible. "He told me I had opened something." "Yes," said Wimsey, "but not in the way you feared. You were the first to observe the ink's sensitivity to heat, to pressure. Your notes, your thesis, he mined them secretly. Because his own work had stalled, that was his guilt and perhaps his undoing." He turned back to the others. Then came the confrontation. Fentiman accused Westcott. Westcott perhaps tried to reason with him, or threaten. Either way, the false leaf was burned to cover the alterations. But Fentiman, furious, withdrew the real one, hid it again, and then he died. Inspector Todd, silent until now, stepped forward. "And you believe Westcott killed him?" Wimsey paused. "No," he said at last. "Not directly." He stepped toward Westcott, who for the first time looked genuinely uneasy. "I believe you." Forced his hand. "I believe you orchestrated an encounter meant to intimidate. You may have even impersonated him. Philippa saw a figure at the desk that night, but not the face. I believe you set the stage, lit the fire in the vault's chimney to coincide with the evening light, waited for him to open the leaf under pressure, and perhaps, when he realized what had been done, the shock, the betrayal, the sheer psychic tension was enough to stop his heart." Wimsey glanced again at the folder. There was no poison, no mark, only a toppled chair. A man who had stared too long into something he believed sacred and saw only manipulation. Westcott's mouth opened, closed. "You can't prove—" "No," said Wimsey with soft satisfaction. "I can only arrange the facts and allow them to speak, just as you allowed the ink to speak. But the real leaf is here, the real ink. And it carries not your additions but your alterations. Your handwriting appears faintly in the margins. Under ultraviolet light." He retrieved the photograph. "This image was taken in 1929, you and Fentiman, both smiling, but in the archive. Logbooks from St. Cyprian's that year. Your name appears only under a pseudonym. One used curiously in a paper on linguistic inversion under chemical duress. The same paper Fentiman cited, anonymously, in his final notes." He set the photo down. "You've been erasing yourself from the official record ever since. But ink, like truth, rarely stays buried." There was a long silence, then Westcott stood, no protest, no apology. Simply a man retreating from the wreckage of his own constructed myth. "I did not kill him," he said, "but I let the words lead him there." Two constables moved forward. Todd gave a slight nod. As Westcott was led out, Lady Moffat broke the hush with a single audible sniff. "Well," she said, "that was exhausting." Philippa, still pale, turned to Wimsey, and the leaf, he lifted the glass case and set it gently back into the folio. "It will return to the archives, classified, sealed, and quite possibly unread forever." He looked at her. "But you must decide whether to read your father's final notes. They're not dangerous, but they are honest. And honesty, as we've seen, can be the most disturbing language of all." Philippa did not speak, but she nodded. Wimsey smiled. "Inspector," he said, "I believe the curtain has fallen." And outside, under the now cleared sky, the dove that had circled Larking Hall for days flew away at last, vanishing like a final ink-stained word on the wind. 4 days later, the rain came. Not a storm, not even a proper downpour, but the persistent drizzle of English endings, steady, unsentimental, and too faint for melodrama. It blurred the hedgerows into silhouettes and turned the gravel path at Larking Hall into a series of soft, reflective pools. Lord Peter Wimsey, seated by the drawing-room window, watched it fall with the detached contentment of a man who has recently rearranged chaos into something resembling a conclusion. A small tray of toast and marmalade sat beside his elbow, half-touched. His gloves lay across the arm of the settee, and in his lap rested a letter, unsealed, unsigned, but unmistakably written in the hand of Miss Philippa Hargrave. He had found it on the escritoire that morning, folded neatly beside the folio containing the ink-stained leaf, which had since been passed into the temporary custody of the Bodleian Library under an agreement more ornate than most royal charters. The leaf itself would be sequestered, unread, unpublicized, and examined only under agreed-upon protocols, with no flame, pressure, or chemical enhancement permitted. A textual relic entombed in glass. Wimsey unfolded the letter again and read, "Lord Peter, I leave today for Bath. A fellowship has been offered. Quiet work, unremarkable, and I think for now enough. The house is no longer mine, nor his, and I suspect it never was. You were right, my father feared what I might come to believe, but he needn't have. I believe only what the words allow, and I choose now not to chase the ones that scream. Thank you for not asking more than was needed. Yours, P.H." He folded the paper slowly and tucked it into his inner coat pocket. A private archive, one of Penny. The drawing-room door creaked. Inspector Todd entered with an expression somewhere between completion and bewilderment. "Train's taken Westcott," he said, "though I wouldn't call it justice." "No," said Wimsey, "only accuracy, which is a less satisfying virtue, but terribly underrated in its quiet way." Todd lowered himself into the chair opposite and rubbed his temples. "So that's that. Fentiman dead of what? A heart broken by his own ambition?" Wimsey tilted his head. "A man can die of many things, Inspector. A stroke, a shock, a lifetime of internal contradictions. I dare say Fentiman believed himself immune to illusion, until the text he worshipped began reflecting something uncomfortably close to his own errors." He stirred his tea absently. "That sort of irony, if read aloud, might very well kill the right kind of man," Todd grunted. "Never quite certain whether you're joking or not." "Neither am I," Wimsey said mildly. "Keeps the palate." Sharp. A pause broken only by the muted tick of the drawing-room clock. "And the girl?" Todd asked. "Will she be all right?" "She's no girl," said Wimsey. "She's a classicist, which is worse in some circles. But yes, I believe she will. She's chosen silence, not out of fear, but discernment, a rare choice in an age that shouts its doubts before they've finished forming." Todd stood. "Well, you've earned your rest, and I've a station to return to where our greatest mystery usually involves why the butcher closes early on market days." Wimsey smiled faintly. A far more manageable enigma. After Todd's departure, Wimsey wandered once more through the rooms of Larking Hall, each now oddly emptied of their former shadows. The study had been returned to order, the wax scraped clean, the mirror covered again in a respectful veil. The fire grate was cold, and the curtain, finally mended, met in the middle with the meek satisfaction of reconciliation. He paused by the desk and ran his fingers along the top. What had begun with a missing manuscript had spiraled into a meditation on belief, forgery, and the dangerous beauty of symbols. No one had meant to kill, yet a man was dead, a second ruined, a third perhaps preserved only by the mercy of misunderstanding. He had said once that truth was a matter of arrangement. He still believed that, but some truths, he now understood, resist arrangement. Some curl at the edges like the ink on the leaf, retreating just as clarity arrives. Outside, the rain thickened. Wimsey fetched his coat and hat and stepped out into the garden. The roses had begun to open, reluctantly, damp with the season, but the sycamores still stood bare, as though holding back their green for something more promising. At the edge of the lawn, the gardener's boy was kneeling by the flower beds, planting spring bulbs that would not bloom until long after memory faded. Wimsey stopped beside him. "Mind if I ask?" he said. "What happened to the feather?" The boy looked up. "The one I found?" "Yes." "Took it to the vicar's. Wife said it was from a dove, but it was odd, like it had ink on it." Wimsey nodded, unsurprised. "Keep an eye out," he said. "If it returns, write me a note, but don't follow it." He turned back toward the hall, and as he walked, the wind lifted the corner of his coat, a final gesture from the storms. Retreat. He glanced up at the clouds breaking apart. "Too many people," he muttered, "try to translate life when it ought only to be read aloud." He paused at the threshold and smiled, and then, with a flick of his collar and the lightest trace of amusement, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The ink-stained leaf remained, silent, encased, and unread, and outside, as if on cue, the rain stopped.